making that push to get the U.S. market such a big one for them to have, especially when you're owned by an American like media conglomerate, right? Like it's so important for Formula One to be a big sport in the United States, and they need to introduce it into some bigger markets where they can attack, I guess, a different audience and pull in a younger audience as well, and go to places where there's more population. I mean, we saw that with IndyCar, when they really started to introduce the street circuits. They were bringing IndyCar to the people.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Backmarkers F1 Show podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cato. I'm going to be joined by my fellow backmarker, Tyler McDonald, in just a minute, and also a very special guest for this little special edition series on our podcast, Motorsport in North America, where ahead of course, the two North American races this season on the F1 calendar, the United States Grand Prix and the Mexican Grand Prix, we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about how the situation of motorsport in North America sits at the moment. Not just Formula One, but also IndyCar, a little bit of NASCAR talk, and also just looking at the general direction of F1's popularity rise in North America. So we thought one of the best people to talk to about motorsport in North America is none other than a former racing driver himself and one of the lead journalists and analysts covering motorsport, especially here in Canada, but also North America as well. Returning on the Backmarkers F1 Show podcast, Mr. Tim Hauraney. We appreciate your time, Tim. How you doing today?
Hey, good. Thanks very much, Chris. Really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely, man. We're really excited for this conversation. Me and Tyler pretty much kind of hatched this idea in the middle of a podcast when we were recording a few weeks ago. and I'm glad that Tyler suggested it, and so happy that we're doing this here today. So in this first part of the conversation, we're going to be focusing mainly on Formula One, and then in the second part of our conversation, we're going to branch out into some other different series like IndyCar, for example, and we're also going to bring it home here in Canada in relation to some of the potential tracks that are being built in our home country and also just motorsport in Canada as well. So let's first of all start off with just the 2021 championship in itself, Tim. We spoke with you last time in preseason testing, and it was funny going back listening to some of the things that you were talking about during preseason testing just to see where we are now. So I just want to start off with your general thoughts on this championship and living up to your expectations so far.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been incredible. I mean, you have to really think about how far back do you go where you actually see two drivers that are just really pushing each other as much as Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton are. I mean, it's been incredible. I can only, for me, I can only go back to like the days of like Prost and Senna, and I was lucky enough to remember like what was kind of going on at that time. I think I was probably like 8 or 9 years old or something like that. But I still remember, those championship battles, and then reliving it, obviously, with all the old vintage tapes that are out there that I do still watch every once in a while, which is pretty incredible. But yeah, I've never seen anything like this in such a long time, where two, I guess now you can call them rivals, are literally just pushing each other and pushing each other off the track.
Well, I find it really interesting, too, the dynamic they've kind of had these last few months, because they get really aggressive with each other and then kind of do that old behind the back bickering, and then once they're with each other, they're best buddies and try to tone down the situation like nothing's happening. It's a really interesting dynamic, and I don't really remember anything like it so much. I mean, when you had Vettel and Webber, those two were just obviously not getting along on the cameras, off the cameras, on the track.
Yeah.
And in this dynamic, even the Lewis Rosberg situation was still, they weren't getting along in general. Where with Max and Lewis, it seems like when they're doing interviews, when they're together, they get along. But, all of a sudden there'll be backhanded comments here and there against each other.
One of the things, you bring up a good point. If you go all the way back and, you think about that Rosberg and Hamilton rivalry, obviously they had the best equipment, the best car, best engine from that span of, whatever it was, 2014 to 2016 when Rosberg won. I mean, you always knew what you were going to get from say Lewis Hamilton, every racetrack you showed up to, you just weren't too sure what you were going to get from Nico Rosberg because of how evenly matched the two of them were. Was, how fast could Rosberg get to engineering the car to get himself up to speed so he could challenge, Lewis Hamilton. Not to say that, Nico Rosberg's not like a great race car driver. What I'm saying is that, he drives a little bit differently. He needed the car to be engineered a little bit more to his driving style, where Lewis just took whatever he had and wrung its neck. You're seeing the same thing with Verstappen, where every weekend you kind of show up. It's never like, ooh, is it going to take Verstappen a couple sessions here to kind of get the car tuned into where he wants it to, where he's on the same pace as Lewis? And then Lewis, you don't even need to worry about. He's always going to be there, even if he struggles in free practice 1, free practice 2. He's going to be around for qualifying. So that's what I mean when I say these two drivers pushing each other to that absolute sort of limit. Because for a driver like Verstappen, he's just naturally talented. He'll make anything go fast, and the same goes for Lewis Hamilton.
And Tim, I wanted to say this question to you because you have the very unique perspective, of course, being a former driver yourself, racing at very high levels in open wheel and other series as well. Can you speak a little bit to what was a big talking point heading into the Russian Grand Prix, which was the pressure of this championship? Lewis Hamilton saying that Max Verstappen, even though he's hiding it, he's feeling it. Verstappen kind of laughed it off, saying that he doesn't know me. But we have seen mistakes from the both of these drivers, whether it be Lewis Hamilton in Imola, whether it be Max Verstappen running wide on lap 1 in France. Can you talk about, as a driver, how do you deal with that pressure when you enter the cockpit of the car, especially when you're in a close championship? And does that pressure sometimes lead to these types of mistakes, or are us as media just kind of blowing everything just way out of proportion, or just trying to make stories out of nothing?
Yeah, no, definitely not blowing anything out of proportion. I mean, at some points or another in a very tight championship battle, drivers will feel it. It doesn't matter when or where. That's just automatically going to happen. It's part of the job, and you need to figure out how you're going to be able to handle that. I mean, for someone like myself, it was always good to have, I would say, good structure around. So I always knew my days were always really planned. They, even down to the hour, I always knew where I was going to be, what I was going to be eating, making sure my routine stayed the same, making sure that my media availability stayed the same. It didn't get blown out of proportion. I wasn't talking to too many people at too many times. Same with autograph sessions. You knew when they were, you knew where you had to be, and that was sort of it. And just understanding that once you get into the car, that's your job, right? That's your office. That's where you come to work. Everything else gets shut out. It's a selfish world at that point. You need to worry about yourself, and obviously you need to worry about the team in some respects. But as a driver, I mean, that's the focus, right? You need to get the best out of yourself and out of the car. Now, perfect example, I guess. And I'm pretty sure Lewis will probably, say no to this, but when, he cranked the pit wall during entry, that like that has something to do with it. Doesn't matter like where or when he did it. That is a clear sign that there's pressure on somewhere, some way, and somehow, because he needed to get pole position, right, guys? Like, he needed it. And then we know what happened. So,
yeah, well, not only did it mess up his qualifying, messed up his teammates too, which completely sewered their race.
Absolutely,
well,
yeah,
at least
for sure.
from what we thought. And then, well, then look what happened. Just throw a sprinkle of rain in there. Obviously, this whole championship fight leads to great viewership for the viewers, and we've really seen a ratings increase here in North America over this past year, 2 years, I'd say, but really this year I've noticed it. I mean, I've seen a lot of friends who were never interested in racing at all, who have watched Drive to Survive or now have gotten into Formula One, and I couldn't help but think, like, what a perfect year to do it, because if they did this in like 2014 or like 2017, 2018, I would have been like, oh boy, we're in trouble. They're not going to stick around. But now I think they'll stick around because of the awesome championship fight. How much does that championship fight play into these ratings boosts?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it does. I think it matters a lot because, if we go all the way back, guys, to like the days of, the Schumacher, dominance and things of that nature, you can see on Twitter or social media anywhere nowadays where some of those folks from that era are worried that it's kind of like, this is going to end the same. It's just going to be Lewis Hamilton winning again, and that's not, this is going to be a lot more exciting. But, once I would say Silverstone happened, then I knew we were in for something that was a little bit different, and we were going to see a different sort of championship, because I believe it was at that moment where Hamilton ended up taking the lead back in the championship at that point. And so I was like, yeah, this is going to go back and forth, and I really do see it going all the way to the very end, which is great because you hold on to that audience, you hold on to those new fans that you've been able to bring in with your social media, bring in with Netflix, and entertain them, right? Because it takes a special fan or a special person to, like, in Eastern time zones, wake up at 9 a.m., right? Or 8 a.m. for the Russian Grand Prix just to watch a Formula One race and spend that amount of your time on a weekend to, like, hang out and take the sport in as a whole. And for Canada, I mean, geez, guys, we're getting from 400 to 500,000, and those are just average numbers of viewers for these races. And, that's not even peak numbers. And, like, peak numbers have to be way more than that, right? I'm just giving you averages. So that shows that the fan base is sticking around. The fan base is definitely engaged. And the more I think we can kind of get a little bit more rivalry or a little bit more controversy or a little bit more wheel banging going on, the bigger that number is going to get. Because, like you were saying, Tyler, you've spoken with friends who you never even thought they would watch Formula One. Now they're watching Formula One. I was scrolling through Twitter the other day, and some rando friend of mine was just like tweeting at Formula One. I'm like, when? Like, when did this happen? All of a sudden you're watching Formula One now? I'm like, okay, that's great. But, like, stick around because it's only going to get better. So, yeah, from that standpoint, I think if you can kind of keep those storylines moving along, keep the dramatics sort of coming, so to speak. I mean, yeah, the number is only going to continue to grow for sure.
Yeah, those are all great points, and it's the topic really of today's conversation is just that. I mean, we have a lot of viewers and listeners who are obviously based in Europe. And it's very different from their perspective looking at us here in North America because we have the four big sports leagues, NBA, NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball, and they dominate the topic, the talking conversations of the sports in Canada and in the United States. But we're seeing it change a little bit. Like you said, Tim, with this championship battle this year, a lot of people that you would never expect to be watching Formula One are now watching it, and not only that, but investing time into it. Yeah. And when we get into the ratings, so of course in the United States, Formula One is airing on ESPN and ESPN2 occasionally, and then here in Canada, it's airing on TSN. And just starting on the American side of things, in the first 9 races this season, viewership grew 39% compared to the 2019 season. In my opinion, yeah, pretty damn good number considering, like you said, the time differences. We're talking most of these races are in 9 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, even earlier if you're in on the West Coast, like Los Angeles, for example, or Vancouver here in Canada. And you have some of the numbers here with the peak viewership. You had Silverstone, of course, which reached 1.29 million viewers, the third largest audience in the history of Formula One on ESPN. You had the Hungarian Grand Prix, 964,000, which was the highest ever rated Hungarian Grand Prix. So these are just some examples here of the growth of Formula One. And you could even see, like, when the race is airing on ESPN2, for example, the Monaco Grand Prix, 934,000 viewers, which beat the 2018 and 2019 race, which aired on the main ESPN channel. And then, Tim, of course, you do a lot of work for TSN, which is Canada's leading sports network here in this country. And just by the way, check them out, tsn.ca. You can see a lot of Tim Hauraney's work after Formula One races, which provides some excellent analysis. And we've got an average that's close to 400,000 here as well. You see some peak audiences in Monaco, for example, 460,000. So it really is very nice to see the growth of that sport. And How much of that do you think really is attributed to that Netflix series of Drive to Survive? Is it 70% of that, 80% more? I mean, it just really feels like that Netflix series was even bigger than what we might have expected.
Yeah, I was hearing from Zach Brown not too long ago talking about the impact that Drive to Survive has had on Formula One, and I think there was a number being thrown around like it's one of Netflix most watched shows on Netflix, like
Wow.
ever. It's one of it's like in the top, like, and so they were saying it's well north of 50 million viewers.
That's
So
insane.
yeah, those are massive numbers. That's a huge data pool of folks to grab information from, to find out, how else that they can sell to these types of fans or whatever, right? That's the business side of things, like we all know. But from the sporting side of it, yeah, I just have to keep going back to making sure that entertainment factor on the track is extremely worth sitting around and watching, because if we get another like France 2019, I mean, people aren't hanging around to watch that. They're not. Let's be honest with it, right? Like, you need a sport that's going to be exciting. You need a sport that's going to be entertaining, and you need to hold on to your fans and into that audience. Jumping back to Drive to Survive, I would say I didn't really notice like a huge. I would say the turning point would be season 3 for Drive to Survive. Once season 3 kind of came out, then I really saw the sport shift big time, and I saw it shift on social media in particular. And at the same time that engagement was coming up, the Instagram, the Twitter, the YouTube of Formula One was also leveling up at the same time as well. And obviously, you're going to have this generation DTS, right? But I also think that you need to show some love for what F1 and Liberty Media have been doing with F1 TV, with, yeah, like I was saying, the Instagram, the Twitter, the YouTube. Just because I think that in itself is another fan base, right? That's another sort of demographic that you're plugging into as well, and it's a younger demographic, and you're going after, like, the 11-year-old, 12-year-olds, all the way up to 18-year-olds, and then after you get to like 18 into the 20s, that's when you're seeing the Drive to Survive fan base starting to get accumulated as well. So I just think it's really smart how they're kind of doing it, right, guys? Like, because they're doing it from a standpoint of like, hey, we need to satisfy our hardcores who've been with us since day one. We need to satisfy our new older fan base that's coming in. We need to satisfy our millennials, and we need to take care of the Gen Zs and younger, right? And I don't know if you guys have noticed that as well, but from my perspective and everything that I've seen, I would say that's kind of the direction everything has kind of gone.
I think what's really impressed me with the Drive to Survive is the character building, because we see all these behind the scenes of different, especially here in North America. I mean, there's the hockey 24/7 behind the scenes. There's always a Hard Knocks in NFL. I think baseball did a couple behind the scenes ones as well, and I think UFC does some stuff. Boxing on Showtime, they do a whole bunch of behind the scenes. But there's something about the mysterious Formula One driver, right? Where you don't usually get to go behind the scenes and behind the curtain of these F1 drivers and these teams as well. I think that mysterious impact, along with building these young drivers, because all these friends that I've been saying who have gone into F1, their favorite drivers aren't Lewis. They're not Sebastian Vettel. They're George Russell, they're Lando Norris, and they're Max Verstappen. Those three. And I think that's very important, because those are the young stars for the next generation coming up. And if they build those 3 drivers in particular up, you're really going to see a hardcore fan base stay with them as long as they're in F1 for the next 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point that you make, Tyler, because I was I swim with a group of people twice a week, and it was my first time back swimming on I think it was last Wednesday it was. And it has been at least a year and a half since I've been back in the pool. So yeah, dramatically out of shape, to say the least. But outside of that, got out of the pool, got chatting with some of people I've known for quite a while. I just haven't gotten to see them or talk to them. And one of them came up to me and was like, "Oh my God, I got to tell you about Drive to Survive. Like, I absolutely love it. I had no idea just how fit racing drivers have to be, and their training regiment, how strict it is, and just how hardcore. These guys are in incredible shape." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I've been telling people that for years, but nobody wants to seem to listen, right?" So it's things like that. I think that Tyler, that you mentioned, that it's just such a great point, right? It's taking the average viewer, peeling back the curtain, letting them see a little bit more of who the stars, I guess, should be, right, guys? Because I mean, you guys have been involved with Formula One for so long. You understand that back in the day, it was about the teams, right, guys? Yeah. It wasn't really about the drivers. I mean, Senna, Prost, those guys were incredible, but who remembers Alexander Wirtz, right?
I do.
That's a name.
But you're the hardcores. You're the hardcores, right? You guys are the ones who've been there from day one. So it's kind of for new fans, you're not going to grab them by just talking about a simple team. It's perfect example you make, Tyler, is that you need to really flush out who these drivers are and their personalities.
Alexander Wirtz's name was it was in the back of the brain somewhere there, and all of a sudden now it's crept forward. I remember him.
Jarno Trulli, Giancarlo Fisichella.
You mean to tell me the casuals don't remember Gaston Mazepin?
Gaston Mazepin. I never thought I'd be talking about him today.
he wasn't in the notes, so. Yeah, these are just some of the great names we could definitely rattle off.
Absolutely incredible.
But good points from the both of you from that side. And I think also us being hardcores, it's sometimes, and I see this with reaction to, like you were saying, Tim, the Drive to Survive generation. I think we have to realize as hardcore fans that it's not really made for us. And obviously there's valid criticisms to make of the series with some of the over the top editing, as we should say, with the fake team radios and things like that.
Yeah.
I hope they cut that down for this season. And as a side note, I really hope they don't blow this season, because really this 2021 championship has written itself. They don't really need to do much other than just package the 10 episodes together in a coherent and efficient way. But I think that we have to realize it's not necessarily made for us. It's for people that have never watched the sport and are just getting into it. Mm-hmm. And you have to kind of welcome that audience in. And if it gets them in the door, it's going to lead to future fan bases, because let's be honest, in the last couple of years in Formula One, it was a little bit touch and go with the older generation kind of turning off the channels and not watching the sport anymore, and the risk of potentially the younger generation not being interested as well. And now it kind of seems like that's flipped on its head and it's heading into the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that they were able to, when they bought it from Bernie Ecclestone and where it was and how fast it's been transformed, you have to wonder, how many other leagues out there are thinking about doing something like this? I mean, I think I saw the Toronto Maple Leafs or something are doing something similar. I wanted to write back hey, Drive to Survive called. They want their show back, right? But, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more leagues trying to do something similar. I know, there's soccer's done a great job with some of that stuff. It's on, I believe it's on Amazon Prime. They've got a couple of good shows on there. And, but yeah, I think one of the other things that makes it so awesome is, Formula One has their own media department, right? And they have their own filming crews at the track. And these guys, I've seen the operation. These people are going hardcore. As soon as 6 a.m. rolls around, they're there getting everything ready, waiting for all of the mechanics and team personnel that roll in at whatever it was, 8:30, 9 a.m. for the doors to open up. And they're shooting everything. And they're shooting all the way through the night until everyone is gone home. They have, in Montreal, in 20... When did I see it? 20. I think it was 2019. So Montreal had redone the pit lane, And in part of the pit lane, there was all of the Formula One camera people's equipment. And it was kind of just like lined up. And all of these charged battery packs and new cameras and new like HD discs and whatever they had to do, they were running in and out of there, grabbing whatever they needed, and you're getting out and getting to wherever else they needed to go. And so they're always filming, they're always shooting. Like their archive department must be huge. So I think like to make Drive to Survive and to actually legit do it well, I think they wouldn't be able to do it without Formula One filming like a ton of that stuff, because I really do feel that the box to box films people lean heavily on Formula One for video stuff that they probably miss, which adds another layer to the programming. And Tyler, like you were saying, like and Chris, you too. I mean, like this is such an important year not to mess up because of all of the incredible like content that has been pumped out this season. It writes itself, right? And it's kind of like one of those things where you're saying like, I hope they don't pump in like the fake, team radio, or you get the fake play-by-play guy calling part of the race, and it's kind of like, yeah, I don't think you need that this year, right?
But especially the last few races coming up too, with three, I'm going to say three new tracks just with the changes at Abu Dhabi. I really hope that this Middle Eastern swing doesn't mess it up with this experimental track layouts that they have going on. So I'm nervous, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll have a good finale.
You don't like that giant hairpin turn they've created at Abu Dhabi?
I cautiously optimistic.
I want to see like a simulation. I want to see a simulation of this, Tyler. I want to see what it looks like. Yeah. Like legit, either simulator or have like Red Bull send their test car there. I just want to see what that's going to look like, because I'm the same as you. It's kind of like, I don't know if this is going to work or not. I mean, I hope it does. It looks like it's going to be really exciting. But yeah, who knows? If it's if it leans in the way that we want it to, with on-track overtakes, then hopefully the championship comes down to the last race and at a great track.
We don't want a 2016 situation where Lewis is just backing the whole pack up, right? And that was just the most ridiculous thing that you could ever see for a championship.
So strategic by him too that season, right? That race, right? Like there were certain sections. I think I'm trying to remember what it was. It was like sector. He would pull away. Let's see if I remember this correctly. So I've driven the track on the Ferrari simulator. So I would say so sector 1 is where Lewis would pull away, and then once he got to sector 2 and 3, he started backing everybody up, because I believe it was Sebastian Vettel chasing down Rosberg, right? And if Vettel had got by Rosberg, then he would have lost the championship or something. Lewis had to win or something.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And it was right after the DRS zone. So he'd pull away so Rosberg wouldn't get DRS, and then back everyone up. And then if I remember right, was that the double points year too?
No, that was 14.
Yeah, it
was 14? Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. Guys, I wasn't sure if that was double points here. But anyway, going back to the whole North America, we'll save Middle East for Middle East. We hopefully get a Canadian Grand Prix next year. I really want it bad because I want to go, obviously. But I want Nicholas Latifi to have a home race and to have Lance Stroll back and being in front. I mean, we have 2 Canadian drivers on the grid. This is unprecedented for Canadian motorsport. This hasn't happened in ever. As far as I can remember, maybe something in the 30s. I don't know. But to Liberty's push to expand all this in Canada and of course in the US now with Miami next year. Hopefully, there's some up and coming US drivers that are coming up, and I've been mentioning that a certain IndyCar NASCAR team should be buying into F1 in Penske Racing. But with all this push, it has to be the perfect opportunity for these things to happen in the United States and all here in Canada as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, making that push to get the U.S. market, it's such a big one for them to have especially when you're owned by an American like media conglomerate, right? Like it's so important for Formula One to be a big sport in the United States. And oh boy, I mean, if they can get a driver into F1, that'd be huge. And then also onto like a competitive team as well. That'd be even bigger. I mean, you have a lot of really talented Americans like coming up through the Formula One ladder system, particular Logan Sargent, Manuel Correa, and then Jack Crawford as well. I mean, a lot of good young American talent that, in all honesty, I haven't seen in quite a while in terms of like the field having that many Americans in it. And that's what I mean. It's like, we had years where you would have one American, maybe two, maybe. I mean, this season they had like four. Like it was really impressive in like the FI in the Formula 3 championship. Extremely impressive. So that is very important for Formula One. It all depends on like how are these Americans going to be able to move up, right? Because the next step is going to have to be Formula 2. I mean, Logan Sargent had an incredible 2020 season. I mean, he almost won the championship, and he's still stuck in Formula 3. It's kind of like this guy should be moved up to Formula 2. He may not have the backing that's needed to make that jump because, looking at a Formula 2 budget, I mean, I think the last I heard, it's close to like 4 to 7 million, like for a season, somewhere in that range. I'm like, who's got that kind of money to spend? Like seriously, especially if you're ultra talented. So it's one of those things where you're going to have to someone will have to put pressure on Formula One to do something about it, whether that be Liberty Media putting pressure on Formula One to do something or someone else. But yeah, someone's going to have to get in here and start giving these Americans an extra push so they can get into that Formula 2 category and kind of really start to show what they can do in terms of the drivers. Now, as for the teams, obviously, you got Haas in there. But yeah, like you said, Tyler, I mean, one of the people I've heard being interested in getting into Formula One is Michael Andretti.
That makes sense.
So that would be interesting to see him get out. Whether that is to just get in with partnering with another team, or if it's getting in and trying to start fresh, which would be a little more difficult. And this is another conversation for a whole other dime probably. But starting a new Formula One team is not an easy thing to do. And like bringing, whatever, 200 million or 250 million. I mean, that's not going to get it done to get a team up off the ground. But yeah, I can see Michael Andretti buying into Formula One someday for sure. 100%.
It's been I say this maybe every 2 podcasts, and Chris always has a laugh whenever I say it, but we need more teams in F1. There's too much talent. There's too many drivers that aren't on the grid. And like 24 cars, even 26 cars, I think would be amazing on the grid in F1.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like you can start thinking of all these different scenarios of how to get them and whether or not these teams want to do it, right? So what's to say they can't get 3 cars on one team? Like if you look at IndyCar, obviously the budget there, it's a little more realistic, right? You can get 4 or 5 cars in some instances, maybe even 6 for the Indy 500 of some sorts onto the grid in one team. It's kind of like, well, if you're Formula One and you're going to start bringing that budget cap down, what's to say you can't bring it down just a tiny bit more and introduce a 3rd car on your team for another driver? Say you leave that seat open for a junior driver. Like, I think that's so important. I think you need that young, hungry talent coming through the ranks, because that's not only going to push them, but that's also going to push like the veterans. You know what I mean? Like that's going to push like guys like Sebastian Vettel. It's going to push like the Lewis Hamiltons. So I think it's important on all sorts of levels, but it's kind of sad sometimes when you see some of these younger drivers who aren't getting the opportunity that they so much deserve. We're probably going to see a few of those drivers drop out of maybe racing altogether at the end of this Formula 2 season, and even Formula 3 drivers. So yeah, it's quite sad. So I just hope they can try and figure out some sort of a ladder system for some of the top talent they got there, because there's a lot of it.
Absolutely. And that part is going to move on to the next topics in discussing not just Formula One here in North America, but like you mentioned, IndyCar, because there's a lot of crossover. Just quickly before we move off of Formula One, you just really touched on it there, which is the expense of the sport. Not just Formula One, but Formula 2, like you said. That's a ridiculous amount of money to just try and compete in a Formula 2 season. And we know that Liberty Media, and of course, especially when you get into the North American market, it's really a lot about money and it's a lot about business. And we as fans, we really only care about the motorsport side of things. We don't really know that much about the business, or ultimately we don't really care that much about the business. But do you also see a risk in them trying to expand in the United States, that they're going to become too commercial? Because if we're being honest, guys, do we really need a Miami Grand Prix when we have tracks like Laguna Seca, Road America,
Road
name
Atlanta.
it. Yeah, Road.
Road
Streets of Toronto. I mean, no, I'm just kidding. That would be a little bit too much for an F1 car. But there are some really great tracks in the United States that are just designated road courses that IndyCar races on a lot, even the one at Indianapolis, which they used to race at. So is there potential maybe that they're going to be a little bit too commercial and just trying to make as much money as possible, and we're going to see these crazy races and the racing isn't going to be as great because it's not a traditional circuit?
Yeah, it's a great point that you make. I mean, part of me being around and involved in the sport since I was like 9 years old wants to see them go back to these old school traditional tracks, the ones that I grew up racing on, cutting my teeth on, Watkins Glen, Laguna Seca, like you said. And honestly, man, to see those cars at Road America would blow my brains out. It would be absolutely incredible. I mean, IndyCar is incredible to see there. Testing in like Atlantic cars was like, so I would love to see them tackle some of the really old school USA racetracks. I really would. It would offer so much great racing because, you would be punished for the mistakes that you make, where, on some of these newer designed racetracks, you make a mistake and it's like, you get a 5-second penalty. What? Like what? Like when I made a mistake, it was like into the wall or stuck in a sand trap somewhere, right? You really had to be so on it, and you couldn't go over the limit of like the track, because if you did, you were definitely going off, where here it's like they're going to go off the track a bit, but they probably would gain an advantage. And so 5-second time penalty, or your lap gets deleted. And so that part of me would really love to see them go back to some old school racetracks. The other part of me understands that, yes, this is a business and they need to introduce it into some bigger markets where they can attack, I guess, a different audience and pull in a younger audience as well, and go to places where there's more population. I mean, we saw that with IndyCar, when they really started to introduce the street circuits, they were bringing IndyCar to the people. And so similar to F1, when you go to the States, they're really, I think, looking at trying to bring Formula One to the people with this Miami Grand Prix, because, let's be honest, COTA is not close to downtown Austin. I've been there, so I know. So, I mean, I think it's a smart move by Formula One. It's definitely going to be exciting. I think they want to try and make it like a Monaco light sort of deal. I mean, I'm hoping the track is going to be cool. I've seen some renderings of it, and seeing them starting to build it gets me, that does get me excited, it really does. But I honestly think at some point or another, Roger Penske is going to enter the chat here at some point, and we are going to start talking about, Formula One going to Indianapolis at some point to race on that road course that they have there, like they did in the past. And since Roger, bought IndyCar, bought IMS, that was such a smart business move, because now he can do so much with that facility. A bunch of us were just sitting around talking, and we were just like, he could do 24 hours of Indianapolis here. Like if you put in a little bit more stadium lighting or something like that, you could do a 24-hour race here. No questions, none whatsoever. You could do night races for sure. You put in stadium lighting. So I could see that happening at some point. Where and when? I mean, when? I mean, that's going to be the question, right? I think like they will need a third race in the United States at some point. I really do, and I think they should start looking at the calendar, like calendar wise, of how they're going to start attacking that. I mean, the calendar is going to be out on October 15th, and from what I understand, we're going to have Miami in May, and then I believe Canada's going to get bumped over to the middle of June again somewhere, and then you're going to have COTA off in the distance again, something similar. And it's kind of like, okay, well, instead of flying all this stuff all the way around, it's like, well, why can't we just keep everything sort of on the North American side? Like, why can't we go to Miami, then come up to Canada, then go down to COTA, then go to Mexico, then hit Brazil? So then you kind of got that structure down of time zones, right? You're going to get your audiences on the Sundays. You're going to get them at a decent time in the afternoon, and then send them everybody back over and do like the European leg or something like that. And you kind of go back to a 9 a.m. sort of schedule. So I don't know if the schedule has anything to do with it as well. I don't know if that needs a bit of a shake up to kind of maybe cater to certain parts of the world. Who knows? But yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I would love to see them tackle some of those old school racetracks for sure. Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I mean, IndyCar was absolutely awesome in 2021. I mean, this championship was absolutely incredible. No one saw Alex Palou coming out of nowhere to win this championship, and to see a lot of the younger drivers like Patricio O'Ward, that guy's awesome to watch, wring a race car's neck, because Palou was very like smooth, and he was very meticulous. He was he was like a surgeon, really smooth hands and everything. And then you saw O'Ward, and it looked like he was wrestling a bull. Like, it was absolutely awesome. The guy has got the fastest set of hands I've ever seen on a driver. It's absolutely incredible.